Hello! Today I'm continuing with my Summons mini-series with a look at Final Fantasy's enduring Earth elemental, Titan. Now, Titan is another deity who featured in the original roster of summons back in Final Fantasy III, and like the previously discussed Ifrit and Shiva, he functions in Final Fantasy as a personified elemental, in this case representing Earth, and where Ifrit and Shiva oppose one another as fire and ice in terms of in-game weaknesses, so too does Titan and the Earth element, perhaps oddly, oppose the element of wind in these games, though sadly there is no consistent counterpart for wind when it comes to the recurring summons in Final Fantasy. And the closest I can think of dedicated to wind is Pandemona in Final Fantasy VIII, which was a title that actually didn't feature Titan and went instead with the more beast-like summon styling of the Minotaur brothers. And indeed, on that note, I think of all of the recurring summons, Titan is perhaps the least prevalent, having not featured in several key games, including 6, 8 and 10, and only featuring in Final Fantasy IX by way of a cameo in the Fenrir summon. But the instances in which it does appear, particularly for me in Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy XV, I think is a very cool addition to the Final Fantasy pantheon, and one that does warrant discussion here, I think. Particularly as there seems to be something of a renewed focus on him in the past couple of games. So, as with the other episodes, I want to focus on how Square adapts source material and the real-world origins of their summons, and jumping right in with the concept and naming conventions of Titan. This is something that resides in Greek mythology, and in particular their creation myth that explains the origins of the Earth. So, in this context, the Titans are described as a primordial race of gods that were born to the personified earth and sky, Gaia and Uranus. And as the earliest progeny of these creator beings, they began to populate and personify certain base elements of the earth, and everything from the ocean, which was Oceanus, to the air, ether, to time, Cronus, was a designated Titan who sprung from this union between earth and sky. Now, turning to Final Fantasy's Titan, and thinking about the associated element of Earth, there's a few aspects of this Greek origin story that relate to it. Naturally, Gaia, being the matriarch of the Titans, is an important one, and the summon's attack in Final Fantasy is often called Gaia's Wrath, probably for that reason. But looking a bit later down the line, to the birth of Olympian gods such as Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, these guys would later overthrow the Titans in a 10-year war. And this is where the element of Earth comes into play, because following their defeat, the Titans were cast down and imprisoned deep in the earth, below even Hades, the underworld, into the depths of Tartarus. And so, thinking about this element of the creation myth, and looking at the Titan in the Final Fantasy games, it's fitting that it almost always emerges from within the earth, or bound in rock, when it appears, because it really speaks to that creation myth where they've been trapped below by the Olympians. And once more, I think Final Fantasy XV was a great rendition of this, because when we encounter Titan, firstly, there's that sense of magnitude, and it really does feel like a pre-human primordial deity that's helped shape the earth. But secondly, there's the almost pained look of captivity and torture in the Titan. And for example, it has an eye that's been gouged with rock, and he's been entombed for so long that he's almost at one with the surrounding mountains. So Final Fantasy XV was a great rendition of this particular summon, in my opinion. Turning to Titan's design, unlike Ifrit or Odin, and several other Final Fantasy summons that tend to be heavily adapted from their source material, I would argue that in most iterations, Titan is faithful to this idea of what an imprisoned primordial being might look like. And actually, I would suggest that looking at existent Titans, such as Atlas, who was punished by the Olympians by having to hold up the earth on his shoulders for eternity, Atlas is a character that's been popularly painted and sculpted throughout history, and it's this image of a muscle-bound, sparsely clad being displaying a feat of physical strength. And I think a lot of that sort of impression of the Titans carries over to the Titan of Final Fantasy, who is equally depicted as a sparsely clad creature of antiquity, who is physically muscular, and also displays feats of strength in his earth attacks, such as lifting great chunks of rock to kind of throw at people and stuff like that. So more than some, I think Titan is closely bound to the source material, or at least the artistic interpretations of this source material. So that about wraps up my very brief summary of Titan, who, as I mentioned, is perhaps a little less prevalent than other summons, such as Ifrit and Shiva. And much like the thunder god Ramu, he has periodically been switched out for key Final Fantasy games that favoured more animalistic and beast-like characters for their summons, such as we saw in Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X. But nonetheless, I think he's got a lot to offer, and if the quality of his inclusion in Final Fantasy XV is anything to go by, his Final Fantasy XVI inclusion will be something to behold, and perhaps more so if he features in the Final Fantasy VII Remake 2. I think this will generate some renewed appeal from gamers who perhaps haven't noticed him so much. So there we have it. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be doing some more summon summaries over the coming weeks and months, so do consider subscribing, or check back in a bit for some more origin stories.